It has been rumored for a while, but finally we got this brand new Lumix S1RII. This is the latest high-resolution full-frame L-mount camera from Panasonic. Panasonic calls it a hybrid camera for high-resolution, high-quality photo and video. The sensor is roughly the same resolution as the original S1R, but now it can shoot photos at much higher speed. It can also shoot video up to 8K or 4K 120, and even internal ProRes RAW video. The camera also has Panasonic's latest PDAF face detection autofocus system and all the other latest features. With the launch price of $3,299, the S1R2 is one of the most affordable high-resolution full-frame camera in the market. But high-resolution camera is a really competitive market. So does the S1R2 has enough feature and quality to make it an attractive option? We'll find out in this review. Before we start, I want to mention a few things first. First of all, this is a really long, in-depth review. I've tried to condense this review as much as possible, but there are just so many things that I have tested and there are so much results that I want to share with you. So while I don't know exactly how long this review is going to be, I'm pretty sure it will be really long because my review script is almost 30 pages long. So save or bookmark this video now so that you can come back and finish it off in case you can't watch the whole video in one go. This review is based on a pre-production S1R2 on loan from Panasonic. The firmware is also pre-production, and different parts of the review were performed using different firmware versions. As usual, this is a completely independent review. I want to quickly talk about the image sensor of the S1R2 first, because the image sensor is one of the most important brand new changes that comes with this camera. When Panasonic told me about the S1R2, the first question that I had was, what sensor does this camera use? It can't be the same sensor as the original S1R because while that sensor was good when the camera was released a few years ago, it is just not fast enough to meet today's requirements, especially for video users, and Panasonic is clearly marketing this as a hybrid camera. That means it's for photo and video as well. Turns out it is a brand new 44.3 megapixel sensor that I haven't seen on any other camera before. Interestingly, the resolution is slightly lower than the S1R, which is 47 megapixel. It's not a big difference, only 3% lower in linear resolution. This new sensor doesn't have a low pass filter and it is not a stack sensor. So the performance is probably closer to the Sony a7R5, which is also a non-stack sensor, than the Nikon Z8 or the Canon R5 II, which uses stack sensor. However, even though it is not a stack sensor, the camera can capture 4K 120 video with a minimal crop, which is something the Sony a7R5 cannot do. For photos, the camera can shoot up to 40 frames per second with full resolution RAW output. Once again, much faster than the Sony a7R5 or the Leica SL3. But the RAW file is only 12-bit when shooting at 40 frames per second. Panasonic says the camera has 14 stops dynamic range with the dynamic range expansion feature enabled when recording video in log profile, or 13 stops without dynamic range expansion feature enabled. Dynamic range expansion is different to the dynamic range boost feature available on the GH6 and GH7. Panasonic hasn't really said exactly how this dynamic range expansion works. My guess is it's using the different sensor readout mode, so it's a trade-off between the bit depth and readout speed. Dynamic range expansion setting is only for video mode, but for photo it does have something similar as well. We'll have a look at all these a little bit more in depth later on in this review. So if you're someone like me who like to shoot photo using Lumix 65-24 expand crop mode to create some wide aspect ratio photos, the crop photo will still have 24.5 megapixel, which is very good. It is much better than the S5 II because with that crop, it only gives you 13 megapixel photos. This is the first Lumix camera that can capture 8K video. Actually 8.1K, and we'll have a closer look at the video quality and performance a little bit later on. Now let's go back and have a look at the body design of the S1RII first. When Panasonic launched their first Lumix S cameras in 2019, one interesting thing was that the S1 and the S1R looks almost exactly like a Pro DSLR camera. They are large, with a big BV grip and a big status LCD screen at the top. But it seems the market response was not that positive, and most people think those cameras are too big and heavy. So this time the S1RII has a much smaller body that looks very similar to the S5 II. Actually, the first time when Panasonic showed me the S1RII, I thought they were just showing me the S5 II, until I noticed a few things like the front video record button and other changes. Then I realized it is the new camera. If I put the S1RII next to S5 II, you can see how similar these two bodies are. The S1RII is slightly thicker, but otherwise they are very similar. The S1RII weighs 795 grams, so it's about 50 grams heavier than the S5 II. The S1R is 1016 grams. If you are a S1R user, you will find the S1R2 is significantly lighter and smaller. S1R2's magnesium alloy body feels nice and solid, but it's just not quite the same as the S1R, which has tank-like build quality. The S1R2 also no longer has the top status LCD. Because of the design of the S1RII is very similar to the S5 II, so some of the accessories for the S5 II may even work on the S1RII. For example, my tilted full cage works on the S1RII, my small rig cage almost works. The only thing that doesn't fit is one of the small bracket on the side that doesn't fit because it seems the camera strap slot position is slightly different between the two cameras. But while I say the S1RII looks similar to the S5 II, it's definitely not the same body. Apart from the body is a bit thicker, there are a lot of other changes. Some will significantly change the user experience. For example, the grip is a bit deeper than the S5 II, but then once again, it's not as big or deep as the original S1R. I haven't held a S1R for a while, but this time I pick it up again. The S1R's grip feels really good. One of the biggest changes are the dials at the top of the camera. Both of the main dials are lockable, but there is no longer the creative video mode on the mode dial. Instead, there is a new switch on the left for you to switch between photo, video and SNQ mode. This is a huge change and a very positive one in my opinion. Previously, if you want to shoot video with manual or semi-manual exposure control, you have to switch the mode dial to the creative video mode, and then you need to go into the manual system to pick the exposure mode that you want, as you can't just use the mode dial to select the exposure mode. This is pretty confusing, and in some way it makes me feel like video shooter is a bit like second-class users, as they can't use the physical mode dial to select the exposure mode, which is ironic as Lumix has such a strong video focus. After the S5 II was released, I even proposed a bunch of user interface changes to Lumix. One of the suggestions was to get rid of that creative video mode completely. To be honest, I didn't expect they would do that, as it is quite a dramatic change to their user interface. But hey, they actually were interested in my feedback. So I'm really glad to see some of my suggestions got implemented on the S1R2. With the S1R2, you just use the photo video SNQ switch on the left side to select what you want to shoot, and the exposure mode that you selected on the mode dial will be used no matter you are shooting photo, video or SNQ video. This means no matter you are shooting photo or video, you will still be using the exact same way to select your exposure mode. And because the SNQ mode is also moved to the new switch, so now we have two more custom mode C4 and C5 on the mode dial. Each custom mode can also store different settings for photo and video mode separately as well. Another thing that quite often confuses a lot of new Lumix users is that when you are shooting video, if you set the AF switch to the AFS position, the camera will still do continuous autofocus. This has surprised and confused a lot of people, including myself, when I first start using Lumix cameras. It's because with a Lumix camera, if you don't want the camera to do continuous autofocus when you are recording video, you need to flick the AF switch to MF mode. So I completely get used to it now, even though I still don't really understand why AFS is not AFS when you are recording video. But with the S1R2, there is now a new setting that allows you to specify the AFS behavior in video mode. If you want the AFS mode to work as AFS when you are shooting video, you just need to change that setting to AFS. I think this new setting will make the camera less confusing for any new Lumix users. That is assuming the new user would notice and change this setting. There is a lock switch on the left which allows you to lock pretty much any of the control on the camera. So for example, if you are a video shooter and you want to shoot video always at 180-degree shutter angle, then you can set the camera to 180-degree shutter angle and then you just lock the dial that controls shutter angle. Speaking of the dial, I remember I heard a few S5 II users complaining they would accidentally bump the rear dial and change some settings easily. For some reason, it was never a problem for me. But if you also have this problem, apart from the new lock switch which you can use to lock the rear dial, the position of the rear dial is also shifted slightly more inside, so it should now be a lot harder to change settings accidentally. The position of the power switch is also moved more to the left, which makes it slightly easier to power on or power off the camera. The joystick position also moved a little bit, once again seems slightly easier to reach. On the front of the camera, there is only one customizable button next to the grip, while the original S1R has two of these buttons. The S1R also has that 1-2 switch at the front corner that the S1R2 doesn't have. But there's now a new front video record button which is customizable if you want to use it for something else. The S1R also has a front and a rear tele lamp. It's something that previously only appeared on the video-centric S1H and the BS1H. The electronic viewfinder is 5.8 million dots. While it's not the highest resolution electronic viewfinder in the market, this electronic viewfinder is still very nice and very comfortable to use. Now let's talk about the rear screen. It is a 3-inch 1840K dot resolution screen, which is okay, but one really special and useful thing is the design of the screen. Photographers and videographers usually prefer completely different kind of screen. Photographers usually prefer a screen that can be tilted up and down easily, while videographers would prefer a fully articulated screen that you need to flip out first. So pretty much every time when there is a new camera, no matter it uses a tiltable screen or a fully articulated screen, half the world would love it and half the world would hate it. But This won't be a problem with this S1R2 as the screen is tiltable as well as fully articulated. You can tilt it up or down. You can also flip it out and rotate it to any angle you want. You can also move the screen slightly away from the body, so you don't have to worry about the screen will be blocked by the cable that connects to the side of the camera. So no matter you are a photographer, filmmaker, or you want a camera for vlogging or take some selfies, you can do it with the S1R2 easily. Now, while the Sony A12 or the A9 III also has a similar screen, this is the first camera that I'm aware of at this kind of price that has a screen like this. I really think all the future cameras should really have a screen like this. Now, apart from not having a PC sync port, the camera has pretty much all the connectors that you want. It has a full-size HDMI port, high-speed USB-C port, headphone, microphone jack, all on the same side of the camera. Usually, Panasonic like to have a big rubber piece that covers a few of the connectors, but this time they changed it to one rubber cover per connector, which does provide better weather protection when you don't need to use all the ports at the same time. Speaking of weather protection, this is a weather sealed camera that is dust-proof, splash-proof, and freeze-proof down to -10 degrees Celsius. There's also a new setting that allows you to have the mechanical shutter closed when you power off the camera. This minimizes the chance of dust that got stick to the camera sensor when you are changing lens. However, mechanical shutter is quite fragile. So if you want to enable this shutter close setting, be really careful not to touch the closed shutter, as otherwise you may damage the shutter easily. I would also avoid having sunlight directly shine on the lens without a front lens cap when you place the camera somewhere on a sunny day. The memory card door has a little switch that you have to push to open the card door. The camera has two memory card slots. One is CF Express Type B and one is UHS 2 SD card. For a camera like this, especially now in 2025, I myself would much prefer if it has dual CF Express Type B card slots instead. But I'll explain why a little bit later on. I do notice the CF Express card slot doesn't seem to take the older XQD cards. At least it doesn't like my Sony XQD cards. So if you are upgrading from the S1R and you have a few XQD cards, it seems you have to buy some new CF Express cards. The original S1R didn't have any active cooling system, but now the S1R2 with the 8K and 4K 120 and internal ProRes RAW recording, the camera would generate a lot of heat. So the camera has the same style of active cooling system as the Lumix S5 II. Basically a cooling fan and air fans hidden near the electronic viewfinder area. My understanding is that this style of active cooling system is not as effective as the cooling system that you find on the S1H or the GH6 or GH7. But it does allow the size of the camera to remain smaller and not feel as chunky. We'll see how the camera performs when recording high quality video very soon. As I've mentioned at the beginning, the S1R2 is one of the most affordable, high-resolution full-frame camera, so it could be a good upgrade to anyone who is currently shooting with a 24-megapixel full-frame camera. And not using a stack sensor is generally a good news for photo shooter, as stack sensor usually have trade-off in terms of image quality to get the faster readout speed. We have seen that trade-off from a few other brands where their newer stacked sensor camera has worse dynamic range and also worse high ISO performance than their predecessors that don't use a stacked sensor. But before we look at image quality, I want to have a look at what is the actual difference in terms of image resolution or detail that can be captured when you compare it to a 24 megapixel camera, especially if we currently don't have some super sharp lenses. The Lumix 28-200 is one of my favorite Lumix full frame lens, but I like it not really because of the image quality. I like it primarily because the lens huge zoom range and compact size. I mean, the image quality is okay, but when you have such a huge zoom range and the lens is so compact, you know you will be sacrificing the image quality a bit. So I shot some test photos using this 28-200mm lens at the telephoto end, 200mm at the maximum aperture f7.1. At this setting, I won't say the image is very sharp. It's acceptable, but that's it. I purposely choose this setting to see if you have a lens with average sharpness, can you still benefit from the higher resolution sensor. So here is side-by-side comparison of two JPEGs straight out of camera. The left side was shot with the 24 megapixel S5 II, and the right side was shot using this 44.3 megapixel S1RII. Both photos were shot at base ISO. If I zoom in the photo, so the things are roughly the same size, the S1RII JPEG definitely captures a lot more details than the S5 II. I guess it shows even if you don't have a really sharp lens, you can still benefit and capture noticeably more details with a high resolution camera like the S1RII. Now we know the benefit of the higher resolution sensor even if we don't have a very sharp lens. Let's see if the higher resolution has negative impact to the high ISO performance. Here is a set of photos shot with the S1RII from the base ISO to the maximum ISO 102,400. All the photos were shot in RAW and I convert them to JPEG using Capture One with default settings. From the base ISO to ISO 3200, the image quality remains very good. We have all the details, color contrast remains excellent. Once we reach ISO 6400, we start to see some drop in image quality. With this set of sample photos, I would say even up to ISO 25600, the image is still very usable. At ISO 51200, a lot of details are gone, shadow areas starting to have a bit of color tint. At maximum ISO 102,400, the image quality is not really good at all. A lot of chroma noise in the shadow area. Maybe it can still be okay if you convert it to black and white, but otherwise it is really for emergency use only. So now let's compare it with some other full frame cameras. I want to compare it with the original S1R to see if the new sensor brings any improvement to the image quality. I also want to compare it with the S5 II and see if the high resolution sensor gives us any penalty, especially at high ISO. I also want to compare it with the Sony a7CR because I have this camera and it uses the same 60 megapixel sensor as the a7R5, which I think a lot of people would agree that this sensor delivers the best image quality among all the high resolution full frame cameras in the market right now. Again, all these comparison photos were shot in RAW and I convert them to JPEG using Capture One with default settings. Now, since the resolution of all these cameras are different, I resized them all to 24 megapixel as this would give you a more realistic comparison between cameras of different resolution, as we would usually look at photos when they are displayed at a certain physical size, no matter what the photo resolution is. From base ISO to ISO 12800, there isn't much difference between all these cameras. Even at ISO 12800, the image quality is reasonably good with all these cameras. From ISO 25600 onwards, the S1R starting to fall behind with more noise than the other cameras. At ISO 51200, the A7CR managed to retain a lot of details, But if you look at the bottom of the image where you see the number 20, there is quite noticeable color shift and also a bit of chroma noise in other area that the three Lumix cameras don't have. The S1R cannot go up to ISO 102,400. So let's have a look at the image from the other three cameras. Once again, the A7CR retains a lot of details, but it also has the most amount of noise and more color shift and lower contrast. The S1R2 retains almost same amount of details as the A7R5, but it has less color shift and better colors and contrasts. The 24 megapixel S5 II has the least amount of noise, color is decent with good contrast, but the photo has less details than the two other high-resolution cameras. So what about the dynamic range? By dynamic range, I mean if you have to do some extreme processing and push the exposure of the raw photo a lot. I also compare the S1R2 with the original Lumix S1R, Lumix S5 II, and also the A7CR. First test, I'm going to heavily underexpose the photo shot at each camera's base ISO with equivalent exposure setting, and then push the raw photo by 7 stops using Capture One. Yes, 7 stops, so it's pretty crazy. After pushing 7 stops, the S5 II photo looks really nice. Contrast and colors all look good. The S1R2 looks almost as good, but there is a bit of bending and some minor color shift in the shadow area. The Sony A7CR is a bit worse than the S1R2 with more bending and color shift. The worst is the original S1R, really low contrast, lots of bending. But overall, since the 7-stop push still give me pretty acceptable results, I went even more crazy and I reshoot the same photo but underexposed by 1 more stop. So I pushed the raw files by 8 stops in Capture One. And the results? The S5 II still looks pretty decent. The S1R2 is second, followed by the Sony A7CR. Then the original S1R is the worst overall. The Lumix S1R2 has a few different burst mode settings. The fastest burst mode are H, H+, and SH. There is also a SH Pre mode. Basically, SH Pre is the same as SH, but when you half-click the shutter, the camera would pre-capture the last 0.5, 1 or 1.5 seconds of photos before you fully press the shutter, and then continue capture some more photos until the internal 70 photo buffer completely filled up. While 1.5 second of pre-capture buffer doesn't sound like a lot, but as far as I know, this is the biggest buffer among all the full-frame camera that can pre-capture raw files. The maximum burst speed of these different burst modes is quite complicated. It depends on quite a few different settings. Here is a table that shows you the fastest burst speed that you can shoot with the S1R2. It really took me a while to understand this. I think that's the result when the engineers are trying to find every single way to squeeze that extra bit of performance out from the hardware. And the consequence is that there are compromises. For example, the new H+ mode prioritizes shooting speed and allows you to get the fastest burst speed when you're shooting with continuous autofocus, but the exposure is fixed at the first frame. Then there is the speed priority and image priority setting, which means the output raw photo is 12-bit or 14-bit. So this is a trade-off between image quality and burst speed. But basically, you can shoot at 40 frames per second with SH or SH Pre mode with continuous autofocus, or between 7 to 10 frames per second, depending on if you choose H or H+, your autofocus setting, and whether output raw file is 12 or 14-bit. Most of these burst modes are blackout free to give you better shooting experience and make it easier to follow fast-moving subject. Panasonic calls it post-fill blackout free, which means what you see through the electronic viewfinder or the LCD screen is the frame that is behind the actual live view. It means there is a small lag. When you're shooting in SH mode, because of the high frame rate, the lag is very minimal, almost not noticeable. But if you are shooting in H or H+ mode, the blackout free lag is a lot more noticeable. I did some tests to see how large the photo buffer is when shooting at H+ mode, and here are my results. Keep in mind these are numbers I measured manually, so there would be a small margin of error. So depending on the type of memory card used and the output file type, I can shoot between 80 to almost 120 photos before the buffer fully filled up. The time it takes to completely clear the buffer is from as fast as 13 seconds when using CF Express 4.0 card up to 24 seconds when using a V90 SD card. So using a fast CF Express 4.0 card definitely decrease the time to clear the buffer and also increase the buffer size a bit. But considering these are 44 megapixel photos, even using just the fast V90 card, the results is still not bad. If you are shooting in speed priority, the camera will give you 12-bit RAW files that allow you to get 1 frame per second faster burst speed. The size of the 12-bit RAW file is about 10 megabytes smaller than the 14-bit RAW file. And probably because of that, the time to clear the buffer appears to be slightly shorter as well. But how much is the difference between the 12-bit and 14-bit RAW file? How much image quality you have to sacrifice to get the faster burst speed? Well, the answer is it depends. It really depends on how much editing you need to do. I found that if it's just some minor editing, like what I would usually do, then there is virtually no difference. Even when I need to push the exposure by 4 stops, the difference is still quite small. The shadow area has a bit of color shift that I didn't even notice until I do a side-by-side comparison. When I have to do something crazy, like push the exposure by 7 stops, then I will see noticeable difference. So as long as you don't need to do some very crazy editing, the 12-bit RAW file is fine. For the SH and the SH Pre mode, you can only use the electronic shutter. Since this is not a stack sensor, so there could be a bit of rolling shutter effect. Also, the RAW file is only 12-bit. The buffer size is 70 frames when you are shooting in SH or SH Pre mode. That equals to almost 2 seconds of buffer. So I measured the time it takes for the camera to completely clear the buffer once we fill it up completely. If you are shooting RAW or JPEG, then it is between 17 to around 21 seconds. Interestingly, when shooting in SH mode, writing to CF Express card isn't really that much faster than writing to SD card. Even though the CF Express 4.0 card I use is supposed to be significantly faster than my V90 SD card. Also, the time it takes to write JPEG or RAW file in this mode seems to be very similar. Even though the RAW files are about 3 times bigger in size, this suggests clearing the buffer is limited by the processor rather than the card write speed. However, when I swap the V90 SD card to a slower V30 SD card, this would significantly increase the time it takes to clear the buffer, especially when shooting in RAW format. It took more than 2.5 minutes, which is really slow. So if you are buying a S1R2 for photos, definitely get some fast memory card, but getting the fastest CF Express card only gives you a small improvement in write speed compared to a fast SD card. Well, for photos at least. Let's do a quick comparison of the shutter sound from the S1R2 and the other cameras. The Lumix S1RII also supports the multi-shot high-resolution mode. If you're not familiar with this feature, I did a video about Lumix high-resolution multi-shot mode not too long ago. You can check it out on my channel after watching this review. But basically, the camera would take a number of photos very quickly using the electronic shutter. Each photo's exposure is up to 8 seconds. And then the camera would combine all these photos to create a high resolution photo that is 4 times the resolution of the image sensor. So with the S1RII, you can create 177 megapixel photo using the multi-shot high resolution mode. While quite a few other camera brands also offer similar features, but in my opinion, Lumix implementation is the best in the industry, at least among all the full-frame camera brands. It's because unlike most other brands which require you to copy the photo to a computer and then you need to use a special software to create the high resolution photo, Lumix cameras including this S1RII would create the high resolution photo in camera immediately after you took the photo. The output can be JPEG or RAW format or both. Not only it is more convenient, but you can also check the result just a few seconds or so after you shot the photo. This means if the photo that you shot didn't turn out the way that you want, or if there's any issues, then you will notice it immediately so you can reshoot it immediately as well. Here is a photo I shot using the S1RII in the high resolution mode. You can see the high resolution photo can give you a lot more details when compared to the normal photo. This photo was shot using the Lumix S Pro 51.4, which is a really sharp lens. But even if I use the Lumix 28-200, which is not really a very sharp lens, the high resolution mode JPEG generated in camera still captures a lot more details than the normal photo. There are a bunch of settings for the high resolution mode and I'm not going to go through all in this review, but one of the important settings is that there are 2 different modes. Mode 1 means any motion blur happen between multiple exposure are retained, so the high resolution photo will have more motion blur than a single normal photo. Mode 2 means the camera would detect motion that happen between different exposures and try to minimize that. Let's have a look at these 2 high resolution mode photos, both shot with the identical shutter speed. The left photo was shot in mode 1, the right one was shot in mode 2. Look at the traffics at the bottom half and you can see the difference in motion blur between these 2 photos. So you can choose between mode 1 and mode 2 depending on what sort of result you want. Another reason why I said Lumix high resolution mode is the best is because the camera also supports handheld high resolution mode. You can capture high resolution mode photo without using a tripod. This makes the high resolution mode a lot more useful and flexible as not everyone will be carrying a tripod with them all the time. Here is a photo shot with the S1RII using the handheld high resolution mode. While the image is slightly not as detailed as the high resolution mode that's shot using a tripod, it is still significantly sharper and captures more details than the normal photo. Now for the handheld high resolution mode to work, you do have to pay attention to the shutter speed and also focal length that you are shooting at. I found that around 50mm focal length or wider, I can get great result very easily, like the last example that I just showed you. But anything more than 70 to 80mm focal length, or when the shutter speed is getting a bit slow, then I was not able to get good results consistently. Unfortunately, I noticed S1RII's high resolution mode still doesn't work with the 65:24 or 2:1 aspect ratio crop photo. It's a bit of shame because this 2 aspect ratio crops away the most amount of pixels and would benefit a lot from the extra resolution from the high resolution mode. But if you really want to shoot this wide aspect ratio photo in high resolution mode, there is a workaround. You can just enable the frame marker display and create a frame marker of your preferred aspect ratio, so you can preview the photo when you are shooting in high resolution mode, and then you have to manually crop the photo after you shot it. Okay, now let's talk about video. As a high-end Lumix camera, the S1RII is jam-packed with pretty much all the video features that you can think of. Shutter angle adjustment, anamorphic support including anamorphic IBIS, proxy recording, all the different kind of on-screen overlay display like peaking, waveform, frame marker. But unlike the S9 or the S5 II, which can display up to 3 frame markers at the same time, the S1RII, at least with the 1.0 firmware that I'm using right now, it only supports 1 frame marker display. Real-time LUT is one of Panasonic's very special feature. If you don't know what real-time LUT is, you can think of it as something similar to Fujifilm's film simulation, but instead of only having a limited number of simulations that come with your camera, Lumix allows you to install your own LUT to the camera to create the look that you want. So of course, the S1RII also supports real-time LUT. You can bait in your own LUT either to the high resolution video or the proxy video file. I've covered most of these features including the real-time LUT in my previous Lumix videos, so I'm not going to repeat them again in this review. But there are also a few new features and changes that comes with the S1RII. First, we have false color display. It's a small thing, but it's something a lot of people have requested. And you can now also enable grain effect and color noise in the photo style for video recording. There's also a new Cine-like A2 color profile. I remember back when I attended the GH5 launch event, Panasonic has mentioned their plan to release 8K capable camera in the future. That was back in 2017. So I think it's fair to say the 8K plan took much longer than they originally expected. But finally, we have the first Lumix camera that can shoot 8K video. Actually, it's not just 8K, the S1R can record video up to 8.1K, 10-bit 420 at up to 30 frames per second. S1R2 can also record 10-bit 420, 6.4K open gate video up to 30 frames per second. Open gate means the recorded video is using the whole sensor in 3:2 aspect ratio. This is really useful if you want to have flexibility during editing to either reframe the photo a bit or crop the output to create vertical or square format video, as otherwise if your original video was in 16:9 aspect ratio, you need to crop away a lot. But then why 6.4K and it's not 8.1K? Well, Panasonic told me that they will have the 8.1K and also 7.2K open gate coming a little bit later while firmware update later on in 2025, so maybe they just need a little bit more time to sort out something. There are also a bunch of other video resolution that you can record using the S1RII, 5.9K, 5.8K, 4.7K. If you are interested in 4K or DCI 4K, you can shoot up to 120 frames per second. This is the first time a full-frame Lumix can shoot in 4K 120. There is no crop for all the high-resolution video up to 30 frames per second. Apart from 4.7K, which is an APS-C format capturing at 4:3 aspect ratio. If you shoot video in 120 frames per second, then there will be a small crop, approximately 1.1 for DCI 4K or 1.17 for 4K and Full HD. If you want to shoot in 60 frames per second, then the crop is between 1.04 to 1.11 depending on the resolution of the video you are shooting. While I prefer to see no crop at all, at least This is a big improvement compared to the S5 II, which requires a 1.5 crop for 4K 60. A lot of cameras in the market right now that can shoot 4K 120 also has a small crop, so the S1R2 is actually quite similar. S1R2's video image quality is very good as expected from a high-end Lumix camera. The 8.1K and 8K video captures tons of details. While I think 8K is probably not going to become a mainstream video resolution for quite a while, but if you shoot in 8K, it does allow you to have a lot of room for cropping or panning during editing. The only thing I noticed is that video shot at 120 frames per second seems to be slightly lower quality than the video shot at 30 or 60 frames per second of the same resolution. It is not a big difference, as I didn't really notice that at the beginning. I only noticed that when I zoom in the video at 200% and do some side-by-side comparison. The 120 frames per second video is not as sharp and has a bit of small artifact that the lower frame rate video doesn't have. The camera can also record internally or to a SSD drive using the USB connection in ProRes, ProRes HQ, ProRes RAW, and ProRes RAW HQ format. Yes, internal ProRes RAW video recording is possible with the S1R2, and this is the second Lumix camera that can record ProRes RAW internally. Due to the high bitrate, you have to choose either CF Express or USB, but not both at the same time. This is the same for most of the ProRes and ProRes HQ output as well. Only the lowest bitrate Full HD ProRes format can be recorded to the SD card. So if you choose USB SSD recording, then the internal card slot cannot be used at the same time. The only exception is when you want to record low bitrate proxy video file, which can be recorded to the SD card slot even if the high resolution file is recorded to the USB SSD drive. And this is the main reason why I really wish a camera like this has dual CF Express card slot. So both card slots are fast enough to record ProRes or ProRes RAW for data redundancy. Now, while it's good to have internal ProRes RAW video recording, but the resolution is only 5.8K, and because that is that pixel to pixel, so that means there is approximately a 1.4 times crop. It means when you're recording in ProRes RAW video format, it's only using a sensor area that is barely bigger than APS-C sensor. If you're recording to the USB SSD drive, any video that is higher than the DCI 4K resolution, or if you record ProRes video that is faster than 30 frames per second, the camera needs extra power. You need to either connect a USB PD power source to the camera or use the optional battery grip with an extra battery in the grip, or use the dummy battery DC coupler DCC18 with a USB PD power source. Would require extra power using one of the options that I mentioned before. Unfortunately, all of these options would make the camera less portable. So it does make me wonder, maybe Panasonic really should create a bigger battery that can output enough power to meet these demanding video formats. When the S1R is released to the market, the camera can output up to 8K resolution through HDMI to the supported recorders from Atomos and Blackmagic. Later on, there will be a firmware update to add support of ProRes RAW and Blackmagic RAW when you use the camera with the recorder that supports the format. If you have a Lumix S5 II or the S5 IIX, then you probably would know that the MOV video file recorded by the camera would always have 4 audio tracks, even if 2 audio tracks are silent. Now with the S1R2, the MOV video would only have 2 audio tracks, unless you are recording with the optional audio adapter and enable 4-channel recording. The S1R2 supports the Lumix XLR1 and XLR2 audio adapter. If you use the XLR2 audio adapter, then you can record 32-bit flow audio as well. 32-bit flow audio means you have insane amount of dynamic range, so you don't need to set the audio gain level when you are recording. And as long as your microphone can handle the dynamic range, the audio would never clip. As far as I know, the S1R2 is the first full-frame mirrorless camera that supports 32-bit flow audio recording, even though it relies on the optional XLR2 adapter. When you record video in one of the standard picture profile, the base ISO is ISO 80 and it will go all the way up to extended 102,400. If you shoot in vlog flat picture profile, then the base ISO is 200 and the maximum ISO is 51,200. ISO 200 for vlog is very low. Usually vlog base ISO is approximately 4 times that of the standard picture profile base ISO. I believe why it's only ISO 200 for the S1R2 may have something to do with the dynamic range expansion setting that is turned off by default. If you enable dynamic range expansion, then the base ISO is 400, which is what I expect for a camera that has base ISO of 80 for standard picture profile. So anyway, let's have a look at the image quality at different ISO first. All the video were shot in 4K resolution in MOV format. I didn't do any processing. The dynamic range expansion setting is disabled as that's the default setting. I'm also going to compare it with the Lumix S1R, S5 II and also the Sony a7CR again. From base ISO to ISO 3200, all the 4 cameras performs really well. One interesting thing is that I see a bit of moire pattern in the S1R's video, while the other cameras I don't see the moire pattern. At ISO 6400, S1R's noise becomes quite noticeable. When we reach ISO 12800, the S1R's video starts to fall apart. The Sony a7CR is better than the S1R, but the S5 II and the S1R2 both delivers cleaner and better image quality. At ISO 102,400, the S1R2 looks much better than I expected. I mean, the image quality is not good, but it is ISO 102,400, so I don't expect it will be good anyway. If we compare the S1R2 with the S5 II, apart from S1R2's shadow area has a bit of red color tint, which the S5 II doesn't have. Otherwise, the S1R2 held up really well at such high ISO. So it seems despite the S1R2 has a high resolution sensor, the high ISO performance is still quite decent when recording 4K video, almost as good as the S5 II. And it is a big improvement compared to the original S1R. We have just talked a little bit about the dynamic range expansion setting. Enabling this setting allows 14 stops of dynamic range when you are recording video in vlog picture profile instead of 13 stops if you have it disabled. But the downside is you will have more rolling shutter. So I did some comparison to see the rolling shutter performance of the S1R2. I have the S1R2 and the S5 II mounted on a solid rig. Both cameras were shooting in vlog picture profile. With the S1R2, I have the dynamic range expansion set to disable. By the way, you can only enable the dynamic range expansion when you are shooting in vlog picture profile, and also the frame rate has to be 30 frames per second or slower. So look at this side-by-side comparison. It seems the S1R2 with dynamic range expansion disabled, rolling shutter effect is very similar to the Lumix S5 II. I don't really see any noticeable difference. Now, if I enable S1R2's dynamic range expansion setting, S1R2's rolling shutter effect is a lot more obvious than the S5 II. So I think if you disable the dynamic range expansion, S1R2's rolling shutter performance is okay if you compare it to a non-stack sensor camera. Unfortunately, I was not able to get a Z8 or the R5 II to do some comparison. But a stacked sensor camera like the Nikon Z8 or the Canon R5 II would have noticeably less rolling shutter than the S1R2. So if you are shooting action or need to pan the camera quickly, then you should switch off the dynamic range expansion. Next, we will look at how the dynamic range expansion affects the video's dynamic range. So here are two videos shot at ISO 400, which is the base ISO if you have the dynamic range expansion enabled. Both videos were shot with the same exposure settings, just one with the dynamic range expansion enabled and one is disabled. After doing the normal grading, there is a small but noticeable difference in the highlight area. Now, if I try to recover as much highlight detail as possible, the video shot with the dynamic range expansion on can give me a lot more highlight details. If you have the dynamic range expansion setting enabled, it is very similar to what I got from the Lumix S5 II. Ever since Panasonic has started implementing PDAF face detection autofocus with the Lumix S5 II and the S5 IIX, the continuous autofocus performance has improved a lot. We no longer have pulsing issues, autofocus tracking is a lot more reliable and responsive, and Panasonic also released a few firmware updates later on which further improved the AI subject detection. The new autofocus system works really well on the S5 II and the S9. While it's not perfect, I would say overall the autofocus performance in video mode is pretty much as good as any other system in the market, which is a huge improvement as continuous autofocus used to be Panasonic's biggest weakness. This time, Panasonic said they have made some more improvements to their autofocus system, especially human detection and the tracking performance. I noticed the S1R2 can detect human face, especially eyes, much better than the S5 II. Even if someone's face is mostly blocked by something, still manage to detect the eye position very well. However, the continuous autofocus performance seems to be very similar to the S5 II. When I did my usual running around in front of the camera autofocus test in my garden. I've then also done some pretty silly tests. I just use a book to block most of my face and doing all different sort of crazy fast movement. But no matter what I try, as long as I'm facing the camera, the S1R2 managed to detect and also follow my face and eye position really well and very accurately. One thing that improved a lot is if you use the tracking mode with human detection enabled and set it to detect human with eye, face and body detection. The AF subject tracking seems to be a lot more sticky. Even when there are multiple people in the scene, the camera still managed to track and follow the subject very well. Look at this test video. It worked really quite well. Even when me and my son and my daughter are running around with us blocking my son multiple times, sometimes even completely, the camera still managed to track him. That is very impressive. But you can still break it. If you have another person that is in front of your subject for more than say 2-3 seconds, or if someone is wearing similar clothes as your main subject or just look very similar, the camera can still fail to follow the correct person sometime. But for most cases, the tracking mode works really quite well when it's following a human subject. If you have watched my S5 II review, you may remember I pointed out S5 II's photo mode autofocus has a few issues and limitations. The S5 II is much better than any previous Panasonic camera, but there were obviously room for improvement. Since Panasonic said they have improved the autofocus performance this time, I did quite a bit of testing to see how the continuous autofocus performs in photo mode. And it seems there are some noticeable improvements. First thing, if you just bought a S1RII, make sure you update the lens firmware because I noticed with some lenses, you need the latest firmware to get the best autofocus performance. Have a look at this sequence of photos of a girl I shot using the S1RII with the Lumix S1RII. I shot this using all area with animal detection. Default AF settings, so basically the laziest autofocus setting for me. I haven't even tried to fine-tune any autofocus setting and just get the camera to do all the work for me. I shot this sequence using the super high-speed 40 frames per second pre-burst mode. I saw the girl was flying towards me, so I half pressed the shutter button to trigger the pre-burst, and I wait until it gets really quite close to me, and then I fully press the shutter button to trigger the capture. So I captured a total of 70 photos, and here are all the 70 photos. With the 70 to 300mm lens, I have already fully zoomed in, so I was shooting at 300mm focal length, but I think I really need a longer lens. But since the camera has 44 megapixel resolution, I can crop in quite a lot. These are unedited JPEG from the camera. Zooming the photo at 100%, there was one point the photos were slightly out of focus, but that only lasts about 5 frames since I was shooting at 40 frames per second, so that was about 0.12 seconds. Then the camera managed to refocus correctly and track the girl very well until the end of the sequence. While it's not flawless, I think the performance is pretty decent and easily the best photo mode autofocus tracking performance I've seen from any Lumix camera, noticeably better than the S5 II. Subject detection also works very well. Panasonic added bicycle detection to the motorcycle subject detection mode, which, to be honest, I actually thought the S5 II and the S9 can already do that. And while there still isn't a full auto subject detection mode yet, but if you choose the correct subject detection type, then the camera can detect very well. There were some cases I was very surprised by how the camera managed to detect the subject so well. If you enable subject detection and place the tracking box somewhere in the scene, with the S1RII, you can just half press the shutter button and the camera won't actually track the background. Instead, it will wait for the subject of the type that you ask it to detect. Then once it detects a subject around the tracking box, then it will immediately follow that subject without you have to press or do anything else. So if you need to track something that could enter the frame at a certain position very quickly and you may not have enough time to respond, then you can use this tracking mode to help you capture your target more easily. But I want to mention there are also some limitations with the autofocus system when shooting in certain mode. When shooting photos, I actually haven't noticed any limitations. Even when shooting in super high speed burst mode or pre-burst, autofocus works very well. When shooting video, if you're shooting in 4K or DCI 4K that is faster than 60 frames per second, then you cannot enable subject detection. This applies to both the normal video mode and S&Q mode. When shooting video at 120 frames per second, it seems the autofocus performance is not performing at quite the same level. Sometimes it works quite well, like this example, but sometimes it takes a while for the autofocus to respond. I'm not too sure if it's because of some limitation in processing power or the sensor or there's a bug, but I noticed this issue even with the 1.0 firmware that I just received, so I thought I should mention it to you guys. When Panasonic launched the Lumix S9, a new feature called Hybrid Zoom was also introduced. Hybrid Zoom combines the optical zoom of your lens with digital zoom to increase the maximum equivalent focal length. This feature can be used when shooting photo and video. Panasonic has recently brought this hybrid zoom feature to the S5 II and S5 IIX via firmware update, and this feature is now also available on the S1RII. While other brands also have similar features that allow you to apply some kind of digital zoom to get extra zoom, like Sony's clear image zoom, the great thing about the Lumix hybrid zoom implementation is that you just need to turn the zoom ring and the camera would automatically give you more zoom. The extra zoom is proportional to how much you turn the zoom ring stabilisely. So for us users, we don't need to do anything extra, like pressing any buttons or turn any extra dial to control it. So this feature is pretty much transparent to the users. It also works with any zoom lens from all the L-mount Alliance members. When you are shooting video, you don't lose any resolution as well. You still have subject detection. I don't notice any drop in autofocus performance when hybrid zoom is enabled. The only potential downside is the low light performance, as the camera will be using a smaller sensor area when you zoomed in. Because of the higher resolution of the S1RII, hybrid zoom is even more powerful than the S5 II and the S9, as the higher resolution sensor allows the camera to apply more digital zoom, more crop to give us more reach. When shooting 4K 30 video with the S1RII, hybrid zoom can give us maximum 2.1 times extra zoom. So for example, if you're shooting with the 2060 kit lens, you can now get 125mm equivalent focal length at the teddy end. This is better than the S5 II, as the S5 II can only give us 93mm equivalent focal length, or in other words, 1.6 times extra zoom. If you shoot in Full HD, then you can get 4.2 times extra zoom. So with the same 20-60 kit lens, you can now get up to 251mm equivalent focal length. That is pretty crazy. So let's say if you are traveling and you have the Lumix S28-200mm lens with you, you can get up to 838mm focal length when you are shooting Full HD video. Or if you got the Lumix S70-300mm lens, you can get maximum 1258mm equivalent focal length. While I absolutely love this feature, there are a few things that you need to be aware of. You can't use hybrid zoom when shooting at 120 frames per second or any video resolution that is higher than 4K or DCI 4K. There's also a reduction in extra zoom when you are shooting above 30 frames per second. For example, when you're recording 4K video, you usually can get up to 2.1 times extra zoom when you are shooting at 30 frames per second or lower frame rate. But when you're shooting 4K at 60, 50 or 48 frames per second, then the extra zoom is only up to 1.4 times. Similar thing when you are shooting in Full HD, the extra zoom is reduced from 4.2 to 2.8 times when you are shooting Full HD video at higher than 30 frames per second. This is still an improvement when you compare it to the S5 II or the S9, as hybrid zoom is completely disabled on those two cameras when you are shooting above 30 frames per second. Another thing is, because of the extra zoom the S1RII allows, you could be really pushing the limits of your optics. Your video could look softer when you are fully zoom in with hybrid zoom enabled if your lens is not sharp enough. Another thing is, with the extra zoom, if you are shooting something that is far away, then you could see the atmospheric distortion much easier. To be fair, this is not just for the S1R2, it is a problem when you are shooting with any telephoto lens with very long equivalent focal length. But if you understand these limitations, the hybrid zoom is a really great feature that allows you to get that extra reach when you are shooting video without losing any resolution. While hybrid zoom also works in photo mode, it only applies to JPEG. The more you zoom in, the lower the output JPEG resolution. While there are some use cases for hybrid zoom in photo mode, but in my opinion, the hybrid zoom is a much more useful feature for video recording as it doesn't reduce the output resolution. There's also a similar feature called crop zoom that is also available on the S1R2. It is similar to the hybrid zoom, but it is for when someone is shooting with a prime lens. User also has to manually control the zoom level themselves, either through a customizable button or using the touch screen interface. It could be an useful feature, but I feel it's not quite as intuitive or easy to use as the hybrid zoom. According to Panasonic, the S1R2 has an improved 5-axis in-body image stabilizer that is 8-stop effective, tested at 60mm focal length. And if you use it with a lens that has optical image stabilizer, then the in-body image stabilizer IBIS and the optical image stabilizer would work together as dual IS2. And that would give us 7 stops effective at 105mm focal length. So on paper, S1R2's IBIS is 3 stops more effective than S52's IBIS and 2 stops more effective than S1R's IBIS. To test how effective the IBIS is when shooting photo, I shot a few hundred photos with the S1R2 at a range of different shutter speed at 50mm focal length with the image stabilization system enabled and then disabled. I was just standing with nothing to support me. I also repeat this test with the original S1R, S1R2, and also the Sony a7CR. So after shooting almost 2,000 photos and I check every one of them, I look at the center of the photo and I rate them as sharp or not sharp. Here is a graph that summarizes my results. So if we look at the graph, the line with no image stabilization is the baseline figure. So anything that is closer to the right side shows the benefit from the image stabilization system. Interestingly, my Sony a7CR performs the worst even though Sony's official rating is 7-stop effective. Looking at the graph, the S52 actually performs better than the Sony even though it only has a 5-stop rating. The 6-stop S1R performs better than the S52. And not surprisingly, the S1R2 performs the best. But looking at my results, even the S1R2 only gives us 4 stops better performance than without any image stabilization. The other 3 cameras are only between 1 to 3 stops effective. Lumix camera's video image stabilization system has become really good over the last few years. A lot of people, including myself, will say Lumix video image stabilization system is probably class leading among all the full-frame camera brands. So let's have a look at this time how the S1R2 performs. Here is a side-by-side comparison with the S52, just shot with IBIS only at 20mm focal length and then 60mm focal length using the Lumix S20-60 kit lens. The S1R2 seems to be slightly better in some area, but overall there isn't too much difference between these two cameras. Both cameras performs really well. One more thing I want to mention is the Zeapon IBIS rating is a rating for photo. So having a high CPR rating doesn't necessarily means the video would be more stable. That's why even though the S1R2's IBIS is rated at 8 stop, the result is quite similar to the S5 II, which is only 5 stop. And when I compare the S1R2 with the Sony a7CR, the a7CR got a 7 stop CPR rating, so it's only 1 stop less than the S1R2. But the video from the S1R2 is much more stable than the Sony a7CR. Actually, even the 5 stop rated S5 II is more stable than the 7 stop a7CR when we are shooting video. And I've also done some quick comparison with the Nikon Z6 III, which also has the same 8 stop CPR rating just like the S1R2. But look at the side-by-side video, you can see the S1R2's video is way more stable than the video from the Z6 III. And this is the same no matter I test at the wider 24mm focal length or the longer 60mm focal length. By the way, I actually have shot a lot of IBIS test video, but I want to keep this review as short as possible, so I'm only showing you some tiny portion of the test video in this review. But if you're interested in the video IBIS performance, I've also uploaded a separate video with a lot more test results. Anyway, while the S1R2 and S5 II's IBIS performance are both very good, if you look at the video that I shot at wide angle and look at the corner, sometimes you can see a bit of wobbling. And this is due to perspective distortion when the camera tilts up and down. This is a common problem when the camera tries to stabilize a wide angle shot using IBIS. Usually, the more effective the IBIS system is, the easier you will see this effect, as the IBIS is not very effective at correcting the up-down tilt movement. Panasonic introduced perspective correction when they released firmware 3.0 for the Lumix S5 II. The camera's electronic stabilization system will use information from the gyro to calculate the perspective distortion required to compensate the camera up-down tilt movement. The perspective correction dramatically reduced the corner warping effect. However, one downside of the perspective correction, just like any other electronic stabilization system, is that it will need to crop the video a bit as the camera needs some extra pixels outside the frame for it to stretch the corners to apply the perspective correction. Cropping means the field of view will be narrower. With the S5 II, there are 2 electronic stabilization modes: standard mode that has a minor crop, and the high mode which introduces significant crop. This time with the S1R2, Panasonic has added a new cropless mode to the electronic image stabilization system. It allows the camera to apply perspective correction without introducing any crop. Here is a video comparing the S5 II using just the IBIS with the S1R2 using IBIS and cropless mode electronic stabilization. If we just look at the corner, you can see the cropless electronic stabilization system has effectively minimized the corner wobbling effect, but without introducing any crop to the video. So I'm pretty amazed by this new cropless mode. I always thought electronic image stabilization requires a bit of cropping for it to work, but this cropless mode doesn't require that. According to Panasonic, the downside of this cropless electronic stabilization mode is that there could be a bit of extra light fall off at the corner, and the cropless mode can only be activated when you are using a Lumix S lens. Now, while I really love this cropless mode, but only being able to use this with a Lumix S lens worries me a bit. If you are a Micro Four Thirds user, you will know that while Lumix and Olympus are both founding members of the Micro Four Thirds standard, and in theory, their cameras and lenses should be fully interchangeable. But later on, when both companies create some new features, those new features can only be used with the camera and lenses from the same brand, which end up creating a bit of incompatibility issue between Lumix and Olympus camera gear. For example, the aperture ring on a Lumix Micro Four Thirds lens does not work on a Olympus body at all. But so far, all the cameras and lenses from the L-mount Alliance members are 100% compatible. All the features would completely work even when you mix and match body and lenses from different brands. So I'm a bit worried that this requirement for the cropless mode is going to be the beginning of a similar divergence problem for the L-mount Alliance. But other than that, S1R2's video image stabilization system is really amazing. And now with this new cropless mode, it is easily the best full-frame camera for people who want to shoot run-and-gun style video without using a gimbal. One problem that a lot of Lumix video users have complained in the past is the high HDMI latency. I have even created a video that talks about this issue. It seems this time Lumix has made some improvements in this area. Previously, if you want to minimize the HDMI latency, you have to disable the HDMI audio output. While doing this would reduce the HDMI latency noticeably, not everyone can use this workaround, as some people do require the audio output via HDMI. This time, I noticed S1R2's HDMI latency, even with the HDMI audio is enabled, is much better than the S5 II. Actually, it is pretty much the same as the S5 II with the HDMI audio disabled. So enabling or disabling the HDMI audio output with the S1R2 doesn't seem to make any noticeable difference in terms of HDMI latency. Recording video in higher frame rate would decrease the HDMI latency, while recording at 8K or 8.1K or open gate seems to increase the HDMI latency slightly. But overall, HDMI latency seems to have improved compared to the previous Lumix cameras. The Lumix S1R2 uses the same BLK22 battery just like the S5 II and the other latest Lumix cameras. I was a bit surprised as I thought it would use the larger battery from the original S1. So to test the battery life and also whether the camera would overheat easily or not, I did a few tests in my studio here. For the first test, I record in MOV format 8.1K 30 frames per second, 420 10-bit in vlog. So that's the highest resolution MOV file the S1R2 can record. Right now it's end of summer here in New Zealand, so it's still quite warm here. My room temperature was almost 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit when I did this test. The camera was mostly in default settings with IBIS enabled and autofocus is set to continuous. The camera's temperature setting was set to standard and the cooling fan setting was the default auto too. So after around 9 minutes of 8.1K recording, I saw the overheat warning appeared on the screen. Then at around 14 minutes, the camera stopped recording because it overheated. It was a bit quicker than I expected, but then the camera settings were not really optimized to prevent the camera from overheating. So I let the camera cool down for about an hour and I repeat the same test again. But this time I changed the camera's temperature setting to high and the fan speed I set to fast. This should allow me to record longer. But at the same time, I can hear the cooling fan noise is also louder as well. I record in 8.1K again. This time, the overheat warning appeared after around 35 minutes. And at around 47 minutes, the camera shut down. The camera did not overheat this time, even though the camera did feel a bit warm. The camera shut down because the battery ran out of power. So if you want to record some 8.1K very high resolution or other very demanding video quality on a hot day, you will need to change the fan setting and also change the camera's temperature setting to avoid or delay overheating. One more thing that you could consider is to record to an external USB SSD drive. This is because the memory card can also get pretty hot when the camera writes a large amount of data to it continuously. So when the camera is recording high resolution, high quality video, the camera card becomes like a small heater inside the camera. This makes the camera overheat even faster. So if you record to an external USB SSD drive, some of the heat is transferred to the outside of the camera. This would help the thermal management. There are other advantages using external USB SSD drive. For example, the storage is just much cheaper than a fast memory card. But there are also downsides, such as now you have an external storage that is hanging outside the camera. It may also slightly impact the battery life. Speaking of battery life, 47 minutes recording time isn't that impressive. But then it was recording 10-bit 8.1K video with the cooling fan running in maximum speed. So it was a pretty extreme setup. I let the camera cool down again and then I did another run of tests. This time I record in a more basic 4K30 10-bit 422 MOV output format. Because I did that test later in the evening, my room temperature dropped slightly to around 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. For this test, I changed the fan setting back to the default Auto 2 and the temperature setting back to standard, as I feel the camera should be able to handle that without overheating. This time, I managed to get almost exactly 1.5 hours. Then the camera shut down when the battery died. There was no overheating issue at all as expected. I didn't even see the overheat warning this time. So overheating can happen with the S1RII, especially if you are shooting the most demanding video format on a hot day. But to be fair, a lot of similar size camera like the Nikon ZA, Canon R5 II, or even the Sony A7R5 can also overheat. So overheating is pretty much expected. There is a new battery grip released with the S1RII, is DMW BG2. This is a fully functional vertical battery grip which can store one BLK22 battery to double the total battery capacity. We have most of the controls and buttons on the grip, including a joystick and a lock switch to disable all the controls on the battery grip. The build quality of the grip is decent. However, one issue I found is that if you connect a USB power source to the camera, you can only charge the battery inside the camera. It doesn't charge the battery inside the battery grip. With the Lumix S5 II, when the camera has been switched off for more than a few hours, the camera would go into a deep sleep state to keep the battery consumption down to very minimal level. This means the battery won't drain quickly when it is switched off. However, once the camera gone into that deep sleep state, the S5 II needs quite a bit of time, almost 5 seconds for it to wake up before it is ready to use. This long startup time only applies to cold start. If you then switch off the camera and switch it back on again, the startup time is pretty fast, just around 1 second or so. But the slow cold startup time is a bit of an issue, or annoying at least, and I've mentioned that in some of my previous videos. I tried to measure the startup time when Panasonic released the GH7 and the S9 last year, but if you have watched my reviews, you would remember I said there wasn't any improvements in this area. This time, with the S1RII, we finally see some noticeable improvements. after leaving the camera power off overnight, a cold start the next day with the S1R2 is around 2.6 seconds. This is roughly half the S5 II's cold start time. So that is a very good improvement. However, I noticed my Sony a7CR still has faster cold start time at around 1.6 seconds. But still, I think S1R2's 2.6 seconds is pretty acceptable in my opinion, and it feels significantly faster than the S5 II. Now, if you restart the camera, the startup time for the S1R2 is 1.4 seconds. Interestingly, I found the S5 II is slightly faster at around 1.2 seconds. The Sony a7CR is slightly slower at around 1.5 seconds. But since the difference is only like 0.1, 0.2 seconds, so it doesn't really make any noticeable difference in real life. The Lumix S1R2 comes in the new Eco packaging, which is a bit similar to the G97 that was released just a few months ago. This is a much simpler and eco-friendly packaging with minimal plastic and other waste. The box is pretty compact in size. While I really love the idea of eco packaging, I have to say the original S1's camera packaging definitely look and feel a lot more premium. Apart from the new hardware, there are also a few new software support that comes with the S1R2. And I don't really mean the Lumix Lab, which was released just last year, and of course it will also support S1R2, as the Lumix Lab is now the new main smartphone app for all the latest Lumix cameras. So there's another new smartphone app called Lumix Flow. I was really surprised when Panasonic told me there's another app. Another app already? Well, turns out this app is designed for a really different workflow. Lumix Flow has two main features. One is video production workflow and one is external monitor. Let's talk about the external monitor first, as it is easy to explain. Basically, you just connect your camera to a supported smartphone or tablet, then you can use your smart device screen as an external monitor. You can see the live view preview, you can change some of the exposure settings, you can enable on-screen display like histogram focus peaking, you can also start video recording from the app. However, it seems this external monitor is really designed for videography, as I can't even trigger the photo shutter even when the camera is in photo mode. And while the app displays a lot of information, it does not display autofocus information like the detected subject or the autofocus green box. The display's latency is reasonably low. I tested with different recording resolution and frame rate. The extra latency introduced by the Lumix Flow is always around 75 milliseconds or so when compared to the camera's monitor screen. This is pretty much the same as if you connect an external monitor using a HDMI connection. And now let's talk about the main feature, which is the video production workflow. The first thing that you have to do is to choose from one of the three available workflows for your project. Each of the workflow has slightly different set of features. It is also going to affect the export stage that I'm going to talk about very soon as well. This is a screen to show you what each of the workflow mean to your project. In my opinion, this is probably the hardest part to understand with this Lumix Flow app. It is not very obvious what are the differences between each of these workflows and which is the workflow that is most suitable to us. But have a look at this chart and hopefully this will help you to understand which is the work that you should choose. There are three different stages. The first stage is for you to storyboard or create scripts for your video. You can create different scenes and then you can enter some text information description for your scene and then you can create cuts for your scene. There are a number of templates and tools to help you create visualization of your scene and cuts. I myself, I'm not really good at storyboarding, but I found I can storyboard my idea quite quickly using this Lumix Flow app. And once you got your storyboard done, you can then move on to the record stage. So depending on the project type you created, you could either use your smartphone as your camera, or you can connect your S1RII to your smart device to shoot the storyboard. I think the idea is some people may just use their phone's camera when they are doing planning and capturing some test shots. But later on, then they would use their proper Lumix camera for the real production filming. When you are in this stage and recording, you can choose the scene and cut that you want to shoot. And after you shot each clip, the app will also ask you to rate your clip as well. Once you finish shooting all the videos you need for your storyboard, then you can move on to the export stage. In this stage, the app would create an XML file in XML format. The XML file would contain all the information of your scenes, your cuts, and link to all the video clips that you shot with the rating information. You can then import the XML file into Adobe Premiere Pro or DaVinci Resolve. Then your video editing software would create the folder structure that replicate your scenes and cuts structure. It will also sort your videos according to the rating that you gave, and then the video editing software would also create a timeline and populate it with all the OK and keep video that you rated. The way how the video clips are populated on your timeline would also depend on the workflow that you choose at the beginning. So this can really save you a lot of time, as you don't have to manually go through and organize all the video clips after you copy them to your computer. If we compare this app with the Lumix Lab, the Lumix Lab is definitely a lot easier to use. Most people can just run the Lumix Lab and figure out how to do pretty much everything within say 5 or 10 minutes, while this Lumix Flow would have quite a bit of learning curve because there are so many features. When you use this Lumix Flow app the first time, I suggest you to slow down and read all the text information and also all the documentation that is included. I think at this stage, the app still need a bit of polishing, but this is a brand new app and a very brand new workflow. So I think it's reasonable that Lumix just need a little bit more time and maybe some feedback from the public to help them polish the app a bit. But I can see this app can definitely be a very valuable tool for solo content creator or small video production team. This app will only initially support the Lumix S1RII, but Panasonic is planning to add support to the S5 II, S5 IIX, and GH7 in the future. Another new software support is Capture One. This is probably one of the most requested software support, as Capture One's theater shooting is used by a lot of professional photographers. And so far, there is no theater shooting support for Lumix cameras. Until now. So finally, photographers using the Lumix S1RII can do theater shooting using Capture One. I have been testing the beta version of Capture One, which has the Lumix S1RII support. Once you connected the S1RII to your computer using a USB-C cable and you run Capture One on your computer and set up theater shooting, photo captured by the camera would automatically be sent to the computer. And the transfer speed is also really fast despite the high resolution. You can also trigger the camera from the Capture One software. And from the Capture One, you can also adjust quite a few different camera settings. S1RII is also supported by Capture One's smartphone app, So you can connect the S1R2 to your smartphone or tablet using this smartphone app and do theater shooting. So if you have a big tablet like the iPad Pro, then you can have a very portable theater shooting setup and use the much bigger screen on your tablet to check your photos. People buying the S1R2 can get 3 months of Capture One trial if they are new to Capture One. Before we wrap up this review, there are a few other things that I want to talk about. First one, when you are shooting photo in manual mode, with the previous Lumix cameras, the exposure preview would suddenly change when you half press the shutter button or when you press the AF on button. Now this doesn't happen anymore with the S1R2. The exposure you see will remain constant even when the camera is trying to focus. This is also the same when you are shooting with an external flash. This is something I heard a lot of people has request during the official weekly Lumix live stream. Lumix cameras also have a feature that allow you to save the camera settings to a memory card and then you can apply it to another camera. So this is a very handy feature, but there's one limitation. You can only apply the setting to another camera of the exact same model. So you cannot even transfer the settings from a Lumix S5 II to a Lumix S5 IIX, even though these two cameras are almost identical. So this is not very convenient for users that has multiple cameras of different models or when a user want to upgrade to a new model. But now with the S1R2, you can save the settings and in the future, you would be able to apply the setting to another future camera model. Let's say when Lumix release S1H2 or S1R3 in a few years time, you can transfer all the settings to your future camera so you don't have to reset up everything manually. The S1R2 also supports live stream either wirelessly through the Lumix Lab app in HD or Full HD resolution or using USB tethering, then resolution can go up to 4K. However, the communication protocol is only RTMPS. The reason why there's only one protocol supported is probably related to the recent security tighten up due to some law changes in a few countries, as we saw quite a few communication protocol recently got removed in the recent S5 IIX firmware update. First of all, doing camera reviews are getting really harder and harder. New cameras have so many features, so many settings these days, and a lot of features would affect each other. So when I work on a review like this, I have huge amount of research and planning that I need to do, and I need to do a lot of testing. And some of the tests I did repeatedly because I just want to make sure all the information that I present in this review and other reviews are as accurate as possible with test results to back up what I said. And there are just so many hidden challenges when testing a pre-release camera with pre-release firmware and also with a lot of new settings and changes that you have never seen before. And with so many features that are related to each other, even just writing this review script is quite challenging, as I like to present everything in a logical order that can flow from one topic to another instead of jumping all over the place or repeating myself too many times. This review script is almost 30 pages long, even though I have already cut out a lot of things, as I know this is a really long review, so I'm trying to make this review as short as possible while still deliver all the important information to you guys. So if you watch the review all the way to here, can I ask if you could please give this video a like to support me and maybe drop a comment below to let me know you watch all the way to the end. I will really appreciate your support and that will motivate me to create more videos like this in the future. The Panasonic Lumix S1RII is a successor to the S1R, but the camera market has evolved a lot over the last few years. Panasonic has also figured out their market position a lot more over the last few years. As a result, while the S1R2 is still Lumix's high-resolution full-frame flagship, it is a very different camera from the original S1R. The form factor has changed dramatically. The features have also changed dramatically. The focus of the camera has obviously shifted from photo to hybrid. So after using and testing this camera for a while, I myself has a few things that I like and a few things I don't like about this S1R2. First, let's talk about the things I don't like. While the build quality of the S1R2 is good, it just isn't quite the same as the original S1R. If you are a pure photographer, you would probably still prefer the body design of the original S1R, especially with that big status LCD at the top. While this is not the first camera to do that, but I just don't like that some of the video recording options require you to use either a battery grip with an extra battery or a USB PD power source that either directly connect to the camera or through the dummy battery to provide more power. I really feel a higher power battery would be the more elegant solution. And speaking of the battery grip, not able to charge the battery inside the battery grip seems quite a weird omission for a battery grip from the original manufacturer. I would also prefer if the camera has dual CF Express card slot instead. Yes, I have also complained about the same thing in a few other reviews, so it's not just for the S1R2. But yes, I still think it is better than the current SD-CF Express hybrid setup. And I was really hoping to see a few things on the S1R2, like the USB webcam support. I know some people would complain about the camera can overheat, but I myself feel it is okay for a camera of this class. It is something that we may just have to accept when we have a camera that can record 8K high quality video and we want to keep the camera size reasonably small. And now let's talk about the things I like. First one would be this new 44 megapixel image sensor. While you may have previously heard rumors that Panasonic would release the S1R2 using the same 60 megapixel sensor just like the Leica SL3, my guess is this was probably never a plan, as that 60 megapixel sensor, while it's excellent for photos, it is a pretty slow sensor for video. Lumix has a very strong hybrid focus these days, so it would need a faster sensor, especially for its new flagship camera, to deliver video performance that is dramatically better than their previous full-frame cameras. While this new sensor is not a stacked sensor, so rolling shutter can be quite noticeable compared to other cameras that use stacked sensor. But the image quality is excellent, much better than the original S1R, and after looking at all these different comparison results, I would say this new sensor is even better than the 60 megapixel sensor used by the Leica SL3 and the Sony a7R5. And despite it is not a stacked sensor, it can still capture 4K 120 video, so it is something a lot of Lumix users have been waiting for a long time. With this new camera, I have a feeling that we may not be seeing the new S1H2 for quite a while. And the reason I say that is because if Panasonic is releasing a S1H2, the S1H2 need to be significantly better than the S1R2 for video shooters. And I'm not too sure if the technology is quite ready yet. So maybe we will see another Lumix camera with a stacked sensor in the future to get faster speed. But right now, if you want a high resolution camera with very good image quality, this sensor and this camera is probably the best choice in the market right now. S1R2's image stabilization system is also really good, especially for video shooters. S1R2's handheld video is really stable, way better than any other full-frame camera that I have tried. And then we also have this new cropless stabilization mode. While I don't like that it only works with the Lumix S lenses, but the result is just pretty amazing. It is just like some sort of black magic. The autofocus system is also getting better. The improvement is not quite as dramatic as when Panasonic switched to PDAF with the S5 II, but the improvements in a few areas are still very noticeable. I also really like the screen design. It is a really hybrid design that works great for both photographers and videographers. Another thing I also really like is the software support that Lumix has been adding recently. The Lumix Lab app, the new Lumix Flow app, Capture One support, and then there's also the Frame.io support added last year that I haven't even mentioned in this review. It seems Lumix is really putting a lot of efforts trying to focus on improving different workflows for different type of users. And Lumix also seems to be establishing partnership with many different companies, which I think is a very smart move. And I also really like how Lumix has made a lot of improvement to existing features. For example, the faster startup time, the exposure that doesn't get changed when you are doing autofocus in manual mode, even the HDMI latency seems to be improved. And there are also so many other little things that if you are a long-time Lumix users, you will notice immediately when you pick up this S1R2. And then we also have the new top dials design. All these changes together really improve the overall user experience. So this is the end of this pretty long review. Thank you very much for watching this review. And let me know what you think about this Lumix S1R2. Do you like it? Or do you rather Panasonic create some other cameras instead? If that's the case, what camera would you like to see from Panasonic? Drop a comment below, let me know, and I will chat with you in the comment section below.